Welcome to Give It To Me Straight, the podcast from Dazzy IT. Each week, we break down technology, cybersecurity, AI, and business IT into practical insights you can actually use. Now, here's your host, Shane Knorr.
Hey guys, and welcome back to another edition of Give It To Me Straight, where we dive into real-world questions and technology issues that we hear from our clients and prospects in the hopes of helping you avoid some of these questions or get some of this information in advance. So most of the time we focus pretty heavily on the technology aspect itself, especially when it comes to cybersecurity and best practices, which there are a lot of best practices that can be gleaned. But one of the things that sometimes gets overlooked is the human aspect of how it relates to technology. And so that leads us to the emphasis of today's session, and that is on what's called least privilege access. So you may or may not have heard this term in the industry, but it basically applies to how you provision access to your tools. So before we get into the specifics of the technology aspect, we want to talk through a little bit about how it relates to your team, especially as you are adding new team members or even promoting team members from one department or another. When it comes to onboarding new staff, new team members, new employees, a lot of times we see organizations rush through that process. When it comes to giving access to the technology, I would encourage you to maybe systematize this and really follow a design process around this. And there's a couple of reasons why. So a lot of times we find that organizations, they spend a lot of time trying to find the right person, especially in the job market today. Finding that right team member that fits the culture, that understands the organization, that gets along well with your team can take some time. And so, if that takes months to find the right person, a lot of times when it comes to the actual onboarding of that employee, it gets rushed. And so I want to encourage you to step back from that. And before you even get to the hiring phase, really think about what is the position that you're hiring for and what are they going to have access to in terms of tools, technologies, data that's out there, anything financial. And you really want to look at this from the aspect of this is a new person that you don't know. You don't really know their background. You've got a resume and you've got some history and you've had some dialogue, but you really don't know what their skill set is, explicitly. And the idea is this is someone new that you're allowing into the organization. And when it comes to getting access to your applications and your data and your finances, there needs to be a process to map that out. And really it needs to come from a perspective of, crawl, walk, run type methodology, if you will, where we start slow, make sure that we get more experience and understanding of how this person operates, and basically build trust with them over the course of time. All too often, we see organizations, because they've spent time finding the right person and they get in a hurry, they just say, well, the job needs to have access to this. So let's give them all the access on day one. That way they can get up and running quickly. And while that may be tempting, it does expose the organization exponentially to what could potentially be harm further down the road. Now, that may be immediately, or it could be years down the road, because we'll talk about how this compounds over time. So when it comes to evaluating what they need access to, obviously you have a general idea of the applications, but what you really need to dive into is what type of data access inside the applications are they going to need? What granular controls do you have to provision that? And how does that data interact with what they do on a daily basis? And really, when each one of your positions, as you are beginning the hiring process, that should start that discussion of how do we approach this in the safest manner that we can go into this with a crawl perspective. Let's start slow, help make sure they understand what they're doing, make sure that they understand the ramifications of the access that they're given, make sure that we can trust them with that access. And then maybe, phase two, we go to the walk phase where we built a little bit of trust. We know how they work. We have some comfort level in what they could do with the data they have access to, and we open it up a little more. And then finally get to that run phase where we've worked with them for quite a while. We trust them pretty well. and we feel comfortable giving them the full access. As I mentioned, a lot of times, most organizations we work with rush through this process and they get to the run phase right out of the gate. And when it comes to data access, there are some aspects that you need to think through. First and foremost, what are they getting access to? And are you subject to any type of compliance requirements? Because you could be opening up data to them that exposes compliance risk or even fines if you're subject to that, especially if you're in the federal contracting space when it comes to controlled unclassified information or what's governed by CMMC compliance. You have to control and document who has access to that and make sure that you follow that process consistently. Same thing if you're a city working with criminal justice information systems or CJIS compliance. So every one of these compliance frameworks, you have to agree that you have a process to evaluate who gets access to that data, how do you control that, how do you document that, and how do you maintain that process ongoing. So really what you want to do is you want to get that inventory to start with and look at what is the least amount of privilege that I can give them day one. And that limits the blast radius in case anything, bad were to happen with this teammate or this employee. Because we see quite frequently, people may or may not maliciously try to do something. They may just do something by mistake. And if they've been over-provisioned access, it could actually destroy data, overwrite data. When it comes to the opposite end of the spectrum, if they get upset or disgruntled, they can actually intentionally do damage. We see this a lot in the sales field. So prime example is in the CRM. If they've been working a list of prospects or clients, however you have them working that, you want to make sure that the data that they have access to cannot be exported without some type of approval and oversight. We see this quite frequently, that organizations hire quickly, give people complete access to the database, have no controls in place, and then that salesperson leaves and takes their sales pipeline with them, along with all of the work that's been done up to that point that has been paid for by their organization. So now you've given another organization all of that data to start with. And it comes down to, how do we give them a least amount of privilege access and then escalate that as we build more trust, especially when it comes to financial access. This is probably one of the most concerning aspects to us, making sure that if someone has access to bank accounts or any type of credit card accounts, most people have a good understanding that you want to limit that, but a lot of times they don't think about how it ties into the applications that they are giving or provisioning access to. Do those applications expose that information? And you really need to map this out, because in the event that someone leaves and intentionally tries to do harm, they've got access not only to data at that point, but actual dollars. And that's one of the worst scenarios. And we've actually seen multiple times an individual leave an organization and intentionally either take data, sometimes even cause financial harm intentionally, or we've seen this before where they actually try to delete data just to do it for the purposes of creating havoc and damage. And all of this can be mitigated if you go into this hiring arrangement before you get that person on board day one with a mapped out least privilege access and a phased approach to provision that out as they build trust. So I would encourage you, if you don't have a process for this today, start with an inventory of all of the software applications each position is going to need access to. The next step is, how do you know what levels of permissions and access that can be granted? So that takes a full inventory of all the settings. Some applications don't give you a lot of granularity there. And so you may have to say, do we give them access to this today? Or do we make that something that someone else has to work with them on over time? Once you've got the inventory of the applications themselves, the permission levels that can be granted, then you want to go through and look at what are the day-to-day workflows and what does it require in terms of access? Because a lot of times we don't find out until we're actually working through this that, hey, this requires a setting in the permissions that we weren't aware of. So you need to have a process mapped out of how you grant those permissions, document those changes, and make sure that everyone's on the same page, so that as you look at your entire organization, you have a clear picture of what each role has access to, when it was granted, who granted it, and what was the purpose of it. If you can do those things, you will limit your exposure to loss, to data destruction, and potentially unwanted exposure of data or trade secrets even. And now in the age of AI, where all of that data can be uploaded into an AI engine, that exposes exponential risks to you as an organization if someone were to try to do that maliciously. So hopefully this helps. I know this is a process that a lot of organizations don't have in place today. If you have questions on this or want us to help put together kind of a roadmap for you on that, let us know. The other thing that we highly recommend is that in your onboarding, there is a detailed process from the point that the job posting is listed until that person is onboarded, of what they need access to, who needs to be contacted, how do you provision that and coordinate that. And that becomes part of your hiring process. If you have any questions on that, reach out. We're certainly happy to give insight on what we see work in terms of best practices, offer some guidance or even some tools there. Again, thank you for tuning in to Give It To Me Straight. I look forward to catching up with you on the next edition.